I'm Susan Taylor Batten, President and CEO of AbbVie, and we're a philanthropic partnership for Black communities. And it's good to be here again with our good partners at JP Chase to lift up the importance of investing in Black businesses. Our mission at AbbVie is to promote effective and responsive philanthropy in Black communities, and we are proud to say that we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Our membership includes leaders in the philanthropic sector and the nonprofit sector, and our network focuses on a number of issues that are critical to our community, issues like health, education, justice, and the like. But it was about 5 years ago that we decided to make building economic power in Black communities central to our work at AbbVie, and that really began our partnership with JP Chase. Last year, given the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on our community, as well as the growing racial justice movement, AbbVie released a call to action for philanthropy on anti-Black racism that includes 10 imperatives, and these are things that we want philanthropy to move on. I want to share just a few of them with you. One is increasing investments in Black-led organizations, particularly Black-led social change organizations that are about building power in Black communities around the country. Another imperative is investing in policy, advocacy, and system reform, because we know that these are the transformative strategies actually to make change for our community. Another imperative for foundations is using endowments differently and to the fullest extent possible. Another imperative yet is to lift up gender and for philanthropy to focus on how COVID-19 actually impacts different people in our community. A most important imperative in our call to action on anti-Black racism is for foundations in particular to engage Black businesses, particularly at a time where we know our businesses are struggling and that once again, COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on the Black community. So we really want to use our time together today to talk about where Black businesses are relative to the pandemic and what philanthropy and policymakers should be doing differently to invest in their sustainability. And our panelists are going to introduce themselves as we move through the conversation, and then I will facilitate a discussion. But next, let me introduce my good colleague, Ted Archer, Executive Director, Business Development and Supplier Diversity with JP Chase. Take it away, Ted.
Thank you, Susan, and the entire team at the Association for Black Foundation Executives, Edward, Takesha, the entire crew, and thank you to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for organizing this event at the CBC Annual Legislative Conference this year. It's my privilege to introduce this panel discussion titled JP Chase & Company and AbbVie, a partnership for Black communities, the impact of COVID-19 on Black businesses 1 year later. The audience is in for a great session, as you will hear from experts and critical thinkers on the topics of business diversity and entrepreneurship. We have hosted a number of panels over the years with AbbVie, and they never disappoint. My name is Ted Archer, and I head diverse business development at JP Chase. JP Chase focuses intentionally and has for years on unlocking opportunities for marginalized business owners, but in particular entrepreneurs of color, where the gaps tend to be greatest and the impact that those entrepreneurs can make, if given the opportunity, also great. It's in this continual search for impact, that brings to bear the strengths of our firm with research, policy, capital, and financial services, and of course, not to leave out philanthropy. And the expertise and reach of our community partners to tackle a number of these drivers of economic opportunity, including housing, financial health, business ownership, and job creation, loom large. Zooming in on business ownership for a moment, while we know it's a proven vehicle to generate Black to generate wealth in the Black community, we also know that Black-owned businesses skew smaller and are underrepresented among businesses with employees. Relatedly, the Black-led and Black-serving organizations most proximate to Black-owned businesses are themselves underinvested in and face challenges when it comes to economic security and the weathering financial shocks. Black wealth itself is on a downward trend to be zero by 2053, only exacerbating the disparity which acts as a drag on our economy. Yet, this disparity reveals an opportunity and, of course, a call to action. For example, if Black people own businesses at the same rate as their white counterparts, we would have 800,000 more businesses, 1.6 million more jobs, and about 25 billion more in income for workers. Now, a year since the pandemic began, we recognize the importance of preserving the gains our communities have made since the last recession and over the last decade as the world awakens to the growing disparity laid bare by the pandemic. But we don't just want our communities to recover to a status quo that was already precarious. We want to design and build a more sustainable future. Black-led institutions, responsible corporations, and philanthropy in particular have a unique strategic role to play in generating economic opportunity in the nation's most distressed communities, and expanding their reach with collective action will bring new sources of capital into the communities that lack financing the most. This is why it's critical for each of us and each organization to understand our role in the ecosystem and then join forces with community partners to make sure we have lasting impact. As the landscape has changed during COVID-19, we recognize that there's more for us to do. This is why last October, JPMorgan Chase made a $30 billion commitment to advance racial equity. Our racial equity commitment aims to address structural barriers in the US that have created significant racial inequalities that have only been made worse by COVID-19. The fact is that existing racial wealth gap puts a strain on families' economic mobility and limits the US from reaching its full potential. I'm proud to say that the firm has committed over $2 billion alone towards growing Black and Latinx-owned businesses. First, we're providing an additional 15,000 in loans to small businesses in the majority Black and Latinx communities. Second, we're growing our spend with business partners that are Black and Brown by an additional $750 million over the next 5 years. Third, we're providing $50 million in direct equity investments to support Black and Latinx minority depository institutions. And then last but not least, we're expanding our investment to support entrepreneurs of color through philanthropy with a $42.5 million investment in the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund. We're well underway in each of these areas and more good work is to follow. But to solve these systemic problems, it will take long-term commitments from institutions like JPMorgan Chase, government officials, and other business leaders like those represented on this panel. And we all need to be in this for the long haul. For real transformation to take place, corporations need to make racial equity and economic justice permanent fixtures that will enable the sustainability of institutions that are the backbones of the Black community, and of course, other underserved communities. Thank you so much for the opportunity to introduce this panel. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Wheat, co-president of the JPMorgan Chase Institute, to open the conversation and ground us in some of the data. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Ted. So what I want to do is to try to do a little bit of table setting for the conversation that we're going to have. Before I do that, I do want to, as Ted did very nicely, thank both ADFI and the Congressional Black Congress Foundation. We've done a version of this panel for the last couple of years, and I've always looked forward to it, and it's been a really robust discussion. It was great to be in the room with so many people who were interested in these topics in the prior times, and it's certainly great to have this kind of engagement as we are having right now, virtually, to maybe even reach a broader audience. So I want to thank both organizations for creating this opportunity. What I would like to do is take a little bit of a step back. I do want to have this conversation about Black-owned businesses. In some sense, that's the one of the populations that I've been focusing on from a research point of view for quite a while. But important context, I think, is what is happening more broadly in the Black community in terms of the economics and how they've changed during COVID-19. And I think it's particularly important for thinking about Black-owned businesses because they are, as many of us know, so deeply embedded in the community. It's hard to understand what's happening with just the businesses if you don't know what's happening around them with their customers and in the places that they operate. So just a few data points, again, to set that context. For a while, the JP Morgan Chase Institute, which I have the pleasure to co-lead for last year, has been doing research to try to characterize as best as we can overall household financial well-being, in particular, how some of those gaps play out across race. The onset of COVID-19 allowed us an opportunity to see what some of the mechanisms that we've seen for quite a while, in particular about the access to cash liquidity in your checking account and your saving account, the kind of money that families have that they really use to navigate day-to-day problems, like how am I going to pay for my groceries? The place where you see it hit the first when a family loses a job. Those short-term dynamics make a huge impact in both the well-being of families, but also the way that they're sort of creating opportunities for businesses in the economy. And so what we've seen over the last year, it's been interesting. It's been a somewhat complicated mix of sort of absolutely good news and relatively complicated news. And so let me try to paint that out. Looking specifically at household cash balances, we've seen across the board that for the median family, the fairly heavy-handed and intensive government intervention has really sort of played out in the way you might expect it to. There's been a lot of money pushed into families with the intention of stimulating spend and supporting sort of the ongoing day-to-day operation of families. And we definitely see that in the data. So sort of across the board, we see, particularly when there's large inflows of program money, we see those balances showing up in households. So for instance, and you can take this as sort of relatively or absolutely good news, we see after the first stimulus payments, we see balances in Black families up about $700. Now, in contrast, we see families that are white having increases of $860. And so, right, there's both are moving up, and we want to sort of point at that because it's an important thing. We want to like celebrate that some of these programs are having what we think is their intended effect in terms of supporting the day-to-day operation of families. That again is downstream important to businesses. In the levels, you see differences, and in absolute terms, mostly because for a long time you've seen very large wealth differences. I think Ted alluded to this as well between Black and white families. For families that don't have a lot of wealth, these increases in balances have a higher sort of percentage point increase. So we see like a relatively higher shift in terms of the Black-owned balances, but again, that's because of the longstanding differences, the longstanding lower levels of balances these families tend to have. On the income story, there's a very similarly shaped thing. Again, a lot of the program, the government intervention is showing up in income. So we would think of, generally speaking, we would think of unemployment, for instance, as part of income. And when you look at the data over the last year, you see income go up for Black families when the programs shift in the way that they're structured. You also see income go up for white families. You see a larger increase for Black families than you do for white families on a year-over-year percentage basis. But we don't want to lose sight of the bigger picture, which is that the levels just start off with meaningful differences. And so again, we're not the only research organization to document this, but those long-standing, slow-moving differences in income persist throughout COVID-19. And yes, we do see sort of all families sort of cross rates move up in those weeks when we see the program money go out, come back down. The pushes into unemployment insurance, of course, those aren't just every week, they're not just like 1 week at a time, they're sort of throughout the period. But again, the trajectories look quite similar, with those levels continuing to be somewhat far apart. So I just kind of wanted to lay that out as a little bit of the context for the economy in which these Black-owned businesses that we all want to support are operating as a way of thinking about the conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Susan and we can jump into the broader panel.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Chris. And it's a point that you're sharing with us that we continue to make from ABFI's perspective as relates to philanthropy, that while we may see shifts in income where, sort of income for all families might be moving in the right direction, the gaps actually remain, right? And so we want to do both. We want to see all people do better, and we want to see gaps in income, wealth, and shrink. simultaneously. So thank you for just sort of laying that framework. And I actually want to start with you as I bring our two other colleagues into this conversation, Makisha and Lauren. Chris, I do want to ask, is there just any more insight in terms of the data itself relative to how Black businesses are faring in this moment, given the pandemic? Just any additional insight that you glean from the important data that you all bring to us on these issues?
So there's two. One, and I didn't point to this as directly, but it follows the same shape. And so let me just call it out. The kind of dynamics that you see in households are very close to the dynamics you see in small businesses. And so while we were doing the research to understand these kind of dynamics in households, we were certainly doing this research in small businesses. Again, you see long-standing differences in the amount of cash that a small business has to operate. And there are parallel important things that happen with small businesses. Small businesses have unexpected expenses. They need to cover in order, and sort of like that lack of the piece of the capital stack that we're talking about. There's a broader conversation about the whole capital stack, but even just like the cash that's available to turn around an order, to sort of deal with an employee that whatever the case might be. Those differences were big before the pandemic. Program money came in, they moved, everybody moved, right? And so it has roughly the same shape. I think the other thing that I would say, and it's more like looking at the data and trying to think about what it means, and I alluded to this before, like the wealth-shaped differences are super slow moving and very hard to move. Like there's a reason they're slow moving. You can move income much more quickly than you can move wealth, because income, change someone's income today, they still have to spend. So it takes a while to accumulate into a wealth difference, right? A really interesting thing about the whole policy intervention space around COVID was that the governments, the private sector, nonprofit, everybody needed to respond really quickly. And so we saw this flourishing of ways of trying to respond, for better, for worse. The policy interventions around stimulus and UI and those kinds of, like, they may not have had the shape that they would have had if people had more time to design them. And as a result, we got to see what would happen if you did interventions that were relatively bigger for lower income families, for families with lower wealth. And one of the things that we've seen is that, like, it makes a meaningful difference in the progressivity, I think that's a word, of the outcome. And so I think it's a really interesting moment to wonder whether we can continue to push that. I don't know if I want to call it innovation, but at least I think it was innovative in the sense we saw a lot of things that we wouldn't otherwise see. And you can see it in the data, and you can see what's happening as a result of that. And so I think for this conversation, like the idea of how important it is to support innovations that will show you things you might not otherwise see, to do them at scale when you can, is one of the things I think is at least implied by the data.
Extremely important lesson. Thank you for that. Yes, innovation in this moment. Let me bring in actually Lauren Castile, our colleague from the Women's Foundation of Colorado. Hi, Lauren, and thank you for being here with us. And I just want to, acknowledge your focus on particularly women entrepreneurs at the foundation that you lead. And even prior to COVID, you had a focus on supporting Black women, women of color, entrepreneurs and businesses. Talk a little bit about what you're doing, Lauren, and what prompted that.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to JP Morgan Chase for this opportunity, and certainly the Congressional Black Caucus. I'm thrilled to be here, not only as President and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Colorado, but also, until very recently, a proud member of the board of AbbVie and a 30-year member. The Women's Foundation of Colorado has been focused since its inception on the feminization of poverty. And when we look at data related to the feminization of poverty, the data relative to Black women is significantly below those of their counterparts of white women, certainly white men as well. Just by way of example, and we all know I am not the data person on this group, but in Colorado, Black women make 63.5 cents to the dollar as compared to the dollar of white men. So we began to ask ourselves what it is that we can do to address the issues of economic opportunity for Black women. Certainly through our grant making from a philanthropic perspective, we're supporting job training, childcare, public policy, research to tell the story. But we thought that there could be more that we could do to leverage our role as the only community foundation in the state of Colorado focused on economic opportunity for women and their families, specifically with a gender, racial, and economic equity lens. So one thing that we did was to establish what we call WIGC. It's not the best acronym in the world, but it's Women's Impact Investing Giving Circle. And that's bringing together donors who are giving a minimum of $2,000 each. They pool it in this giving circle. And then we distributed those funds to entrepreneurial groups, social enterprise, they could be for-profit, a full range of opportunities, who then did pitches to us. You'll be hearing in a few moments from one of the very first recipients of that. We were proud of Makisha Booth, who leads istabiz. And our focus was, and the group is now co-chaired by a woman entrepreneur as well, who's a graduate of istabiz, a Black woman entrepreneur. But the intent was to provide low interest loans, approximately 2%, to these organizations. And in addition, for istabiz, we pulled together our donor advised funds, leveraging another resource available to us to create the istabiz loan fund as well, for her to pass on to the entrepreneurs, the Black women entrepreneurs with whom she works as her sole focus. So Makisha will tell you more about that as well. And then, lastly, I think, and many of the women, we need to be clear, reach across the Black diaspora, who are the beneficiaries of these activities as well. Village Institute being another example. The Jekyll Foundation that does STEM have all been, again, a Black-owned social enterprise supporting STEM education and a Black women-led. But Susan, I think it's important to also acknowledge something that we're very proud of as another business strategy for us, which was to sign the ABFI pledge for diverse managers. And just as WIGC, the Women's Impact Investing Giving Circle, we believe was the first of its nature in the country, I think there's a somewhat unique, to my knowledge, approach to our signing that pledge. We have had a gender lens that has been a broadly diverse gender lens of our investment portfolio for some time. Close to 70% has had a gender lens to it. But we went beyond that with the diverse managers of saying not only that 25% would be women and people of color, but that 10% of our managers would explicitly be not just BIPOC, but Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian managers. And I'm happy to share more about how we define that. So our grant making, we have a Women and Girls of Color Fund that gives grants with significant beneficiaries being Black, organizations on the Front Range, but integrating all of our work with the lens of understanding that Black women are a source of economic power. American Express has told us that, McKinsey has told us that, Goldman Sachs has told us that, JP Morgan just told us that, and we need to lift up, because the investments, just from a philanthropic grant-making perspective, are only 0.5% of all the resources that go to women and girls. Only 0.5% go to women and girls of color. So lifting up Black women and women of color is a very specific strategy integrated into all of our work.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren, for all that you do and for also bringing up the diverse asset managers pledge that AbbVie is now moving into the field for colleagues to know of the trillions of dollars of assets under management within the field of philanthropy, less than 1% managed by minority and women-owned firms. And we are pushing at AbbVie to get more, particularly Black investment firms, into the work of managing foundation endowments. So thank you for that, Lauren. Makisha, I can't wait to hear about istabiz because Lauren Castillo talks about it all the time, and it's like the coolest name that I know, and I know it's about business. Please welcome, thank you for doing this. Talk a little bit about the network and particularly what you are seeing and feeling as it relates to supporting Black women entrepreneurs during this pandemic. What are you seeing from your vantage point?
Sure. Thanks, Susan. And I echo Lauren's sentiments and my thanks to the Congressional Black Caucus. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. It's a very important conversation impacting our businesses right now. istabiz is a business accelerator for Black women entrepreneurs. We provide coaching, training, and technical assistance to our program participants and members. And because of funders like the Women's Foundation of Colorado and leaders like Lauren Castile, we have a loan fund just under $1 million in Colorado for our members to offer them micro loans up to $50K in partnership with the CDFI, a local CDFI. The larger population of Black businesses, as Chris mentioned, are solopreneurs and micro businesses without access to capital. So our focus is helping these groups develop scalable, profitable business models and taking their first steps toward accessing capital and implementing growth strategies. And so when you think about COVID, they say in America that when America, catches a cold, Black people have the flu. And basically it just speaks to the fact that prior to the pandemic, our Black businesses were already experiencing a pandemic. We had no access to capital. Most of our businesses did not. Most of our businesses do not have cash reserves. Most of our businesses do not have friends and family dollars. Their incoming revenue is their current month's cash flow. And so during the pandemic in March, I was getting 5 a.m. calls saying I can't get to the federal and state dollars. April, it was closer to even. And I'm not going to make it to next month. My business doors will shut. And so what I was hearing at 5 a.m., the text messages I was getting was reflected in the numbers where they said about 40% Black ownership business declined by more than 40%. And we were the largest drop across any other ethnic group. And so I was seeing that anecdotally with my businesses in Colorado and beyond, because we do have members and participants across the nation. So we immediately started to help folks apply for grants, get their financials in order. We called together a group of Black women accountants to help them do that. We raised $85K in 4 weeks, which is a big deal considering that it's very hard to get to cash flow for Black-led, Black-serving organizations and Black businesses. And we distributed that out to our brick and mortars and other businesses that badly needed operations expenses in March and April, just to see if we could build a bridge while we tried to then reach out to policymakers and discuss what was happening with their lack of access to PPP and other types of funds, state, local, federal, and private dollars. We also called together service providers to help with crisis marketing, to help them think about how to pivot, how to co-op, all the things they could do to just survive and get through the pandemic while we moved forward to try to figure out some bigger advocacy work that we could do for them.
This last point that you made, Makisha, about pivoting, I would love to. I don't know if there's data, Chris, on the innovation and the pivoting of Black businesses during the pandemic, but we have seen so much, just again, the ingenuity of our people. I'm curious, do we know anything about the pivot strategies that Makisha's talking about?
There's data that's out there, and I may not know exactly what it is, but it's really the one thing I would say is, the data that we certainly see at least speaks to the importance of that pivot, because as I thought about it and experienced it while these questions were inbound live last year, right? One of the biggest questions was, for customer facing businesses, like where you have customers that aren't comfortable coming into your stores. Do you have the ability to kind of make that technology pivot to find a way, even if you don't really change the product that you're offering? If it's a service, you probably need to pivot that too, but can you find a way to move that into an online channel in one way or another? And, you know, like, what are the things that set you up to be able to make that pivot? Like having a lot of cash on hand to try to experiment with things, like having had the excess revenue to invest in those kinds of things in the prior period. So we don't directly observe it, but I certainly was worried about it, I can say. And then in the spending data that we see, so we have another publication series that we release on a fairly regular basis. The difference in the growth rates between online and offline spend were just like enormous, and they persist. At least they have been persistent as far as we've seen. So, you know, the top line numbers that you might see about spending coming back in 2021, they are undoubtedly correct in the aggregate. But when you start splitting out, like, what does the experience look like if you can sell something online versus not? Those online sales have been like they maybe came to zero growth-ish for like a little while, right in the middle, where everybody pulled back on a lot of things, but they immediately jumped back up, and it continues to grow incredibly strong. Offline sales have been down, they have stayed down, right? Like they have come back up from the depths, but they're still below where they were. I think that's a story that gets lost in some of the top line numbers, and is, insofar as I could guess, like particularly relevant to smaller businesses. And as Makisha was saying, most of our businesses are smaller businesses. They don't necessarily have the money in place to make the investments that you might need, you know, to take the time off from sort of getting the sales out the door, to build a new system and a new way of building new relationships with customers. And so I think it's incredibly important. I would love to know if there is actual data on what these firms have been doing, because I think it's a really important thing to pay attention to and to make sure we find a way to support.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Makisha, actually, I'm going to come back to you. I'm curious if you have any last comments on this issue about how you've seen our businesses pivot, you know, during the pandemic. But also, I just wanted to ensure that we get a fuller understanding of SisterBiz. I understand you're a global network, and so I wanted to hear you talk about that sort of piece of your world as well.
Sure. So all of our services, we began in 2018 as a nonprofit that was Colorado based, but we thought we would kind of tackle the mountain region in terms of providing the coaching, the training, the technical assistance, and then started learning that the need for the services we provided and the way that we provide them was far greater than Colorado, and began to see interest across the country and even in London and Canada. And so we moved it into more of a global view of, you know, our work and service. As far as the pivoting goes, you know, I think we're probably the best. Black women are the best at pivoting. We've had to do it for our kids. We've had to make $1 out of 15 cents, you know, and so, you know, immediately, I do want to call out that the digital ecosystem and climate really did impact us, because we don't have access to the brick and mortar space, the commercial space. We were there in that space more heavily because that was a place where we could sell and that sort of thing. And as soon as everyone else rushed to that space, it did impact in our SEO, our search engine optimization, our ability to build, you know, to capture the online market, because it just went crazy. But the ways I've seen people pivot are selling things that people needed during that time. Like, everybody knows what was hard to get a hold of at that time, like toilet paper and masks. And so you saw our women starting to think about, what do people need right now? How can I pivot to provide some maybe things that aren't, you know, in my inventory, and maybe won't even generally make sense for me to offer in my inventory? How do I, with less resources, build a technological infrastructure to reach my folks online? How do I think about curbside and delivery and all those things in a different way, and build those systems pretty quickly, and do so in a fashion where I can collaborate with other businesses so that we can make it happen, because we don't have the resources. And so we had a salon mastermind where we pulled together to think about PPE kits and space in salons, and how you think about spatial design. All the things that everyone else was doing, we were doing it with a fraction of the resources.
Amazing. And I think you're right, sister, in terms of Black women being the purveyors of pivot. And the other thing that you mentioned, Makisha, that I just want to lift up, I heard you say that you organized a group of Black women accountants to work with Black women entrepreneurs. And it just goes to show, in times of severe trouble, pain, and challenge, that we've got all the resources we actually need in our community. It's just about organizing in these moments, about organizing. So I'm going to save the big question for last to all of you, about what philanthropy should be doing differently, what policymakers needs to be doing differently at this moment. But Lauren, in terms of pivots, right, we're talking about Black women entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs, period, pivoting in this moment. Talk a little bit about pivots in philanthropy as you see it, what's been happening over the last year, even just from your own experience as it relates to this issue of supporting, building wealth in our community, supporting Black businesses. I'm just curious about any thoughts in the top of your head about pivots, changes, strategies that you've seen just within your foundation or sector-wide.
Sure. It's interesting. As I mentioned earlier, I've been in the field since 1990 in a leadership capacity. And the trend lines that I have seen and where we are at this moment was a long time coming. And I hope that we don't shift away from where we are now. There was a New York Times article in November of 2020, and the headline was, "Racism Impoverishes the Whole Economy." And I think that the intersection of both the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and the racial awakening or reckoning that we are, and the conversations that we're hearing in philanthropy now have at this point in time changed a lot of things. I think how we're doing our grant making, how we're responding to community who's serving on our boards, how we're changing our processes to become more accessible, trust-based philanthropy. We love to make up words, right? Collective philanthropy, trust-based philanthropy, participatory philanthropy. But the bottom line is really becoming valued community partners and asking ourselves in real meaningful ways, not just superficial, who's not at the table, who needs to be. So if we accept that racism impoverishes the whole economy, then it is incumbent upon us to use every tool that we have in our tool sheds to change that, to ensure that the wealth gap is in fact closed, because everyone benefits and it is long overdue. We also hold a giving circle, Black Women's Giving Circle. Their mobilization as well, and our creating the kind of partnership that we have, for example, with Makisha, it represents a deep commitment on our part that I think is replicable in other philanthropy. Karen McNeil Miller is an example, who's president of the AbbVie board and is also Colorado-based. Don't forget about Colorado. People think things only happen on the coast. Colorado, things are happening in Colorado, but the Colorado Health Foundation has taken on racial equity as well in significant ways. I'm really proud of our board. Our board is a little over 50% people of color and other diverse representations. But our white board members issued a statement that said, "I should not stand alone." And this is the first time ever in the history of the foundation that the board has made a statement, and that they called out their need, the white women on our board and within our communities, to stand in solidarity with us. And that gender, racial, economic equity intersection is clearly understood by our community. But I think you're seeing investments in small community foundations such as ourselves, Women Fund, other community foundations, and certainly private. There's the $1 billion for Black Girls Fund. There's the Black Feminist Fund. My challenge to philanthropy, to close this out, is to say these should not be initiatives. These should not be programs. We need to pave the way forward in order to ensure that our economic ecosystem in fact works for everyone. And again, back to the research done by JP Morgan, American Express, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, has made it very clear that that equity lens of redistribution of resources is essential for all of us. And philanthropy just needs to stay the course.
Thank you so much for that, Lauren. True words. We've got just a few minutes left. And as I say, I'm going to close with that big question about what needs to be happening in this moment. I actually have one more question for you, Chris, and it really is to you and our colleague, Ted, who I think had to transition. But just given the data that you all have and the important work that you all have been doing at JP Morgan, do you have any particular advice for Black business owners in this moment, given the challenging times that we're in, given what the data says, what you understand, just your insight, just curious about advice you would give folks?
That is a good question. See, I'm thinking, which is always
yes.
I can tell you what we're thinking about, and then I'll try to maybe connect that to what the implications are in terms of advice. Even in April of last year, we had to make some decisions just as a research organization, because the work that we do takes a little bit of while to sort of get from conceptualization to actually having something to say to the world. And so we had a lot of conversations about how much of our time should we spend documenting what has happened. Super important, right? I wouldn't be able to tell you the things that I told you earlier today. We hadn't invested any time in just documenting what was happening as it was going along. And at what point, or how should we think about allocating time and energy to thinking about what's going to happen next? And so that's a little bit where my head is now. We are trying to sort of build as best as we can, a view of, how can we better understand the conditions under which owning a business and sort of operating a business is actually building wealth, right? Because it can go both ways. Your business might not work, right? With entrepreneurs are helpfully incredibly optimistic. Right? We wouldn't have the things we have if entrepreneurs weren't really super optimistic, but some businesses do super well and some don't. Putting into place a better understanding of how to build new wealth, what kinds of opportunities to take advantage of, the things that work, the things that don't work, in a new world that has some of the shape that I think Lauren was starting to paint. We have seen people consider new questions about racial equity, or consider them in a new way, or at least in a refreshed way. I think if I was a business trying to figure out what does my next opportunity look like, or how can I solidify some of the things I learned when I pivoted to a thing that maybe made sense in a temporary way. But what can I take from that and sort of land in a way that's going to be sustainable? Am I the kind of business that can not only just provide for my family and sort of provide a good income, which is a lot of businesses are doing that super well, but can I grow? Can I scale? It's just nudging businesses to think a little bit about what maybe the next step of growth might look like, what changes they might need to make. If you were thinking about starting a business, you haven't started a business yet, there was a huge business formation over the last year, which was a bit of a surprise, I think, to everybody. With whatever we thought the story was of the closure, is a very clear story with many businesses formed, right? So just lots of little data points around the edge that something is changing. There may be new opportunities, whether you currently own a business that you might do a slightly different way, or whether you are an entrepreneur who hasn't started your business yet, looking to take advantage of opportunity. I think now is an especially good time to take advantage of that and to really try to understand what exactly is changing in the world so that you can grow and be successful and contribute to sort of the overall health of the Black community, overall financial. Yeah.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful, actually. I want to hear, Makisha, I'm dying to hear your thoughts on that. In terms of advice, right? Women entrepreneurs, Black women entrepreneurs, starting up now or just sustaining in this moment, what do you say to the colleagues in your network?
So one of the biggest things that we're doing right now and that we encourage our women to do is build back office capacity. And so what we learned really quickly is that when grants and loans and all sorts of opportunities that had never been available before came forward, a lot of our businesses weren't prepared. We didn't have the capacity to manage our back office, our accounting procedures, our infrastructure and staffing, and all the things were built and running the way they needed to run when we had no resources. And so we learned very quickly, a lot of our women learned very quickly the importance of having your financials, your records, your back office, in order. And what it looked like to pull that. So we have a back office boot camp we do. It's starting in a week or two, and it's free and open, to the public, to our Black community. And I would say that's the biggest thing. And while these funds are available, grants and different investors are interested, I don't know how long that trend is going to last. I would hope that it's what Lauren says, that it'll become integrated in everyday life. It'll be the way we do business and the way we run business, but we don't know. And if it ends, I want you to be able to look back as a business and say, what did I do to take that opportunity and build something more sustainable, and build something that was more about legacy building and wealth building than just getting through.
My goodness. I just want to connect the point that Chris made in terms of nudging Black business owners to think about what might be the next step, and your strategy that you put in place in terms of a back office boot camp. I had to write that down because we're seeing the same things, as relates to Black-led nonprofit organizations around the country. This movement of money, right, for Black people from philanthropy around the US, finding it very challenging for many of the organizations in our community that are closest to people, closest to community, not having the back office support. And so we reference, colleagues, something called building infrastructure, Black-led infrastructure for political and economic power in Black communities. And that includes infrastructure for Black businesses, that includes infrastructure for Black-led organizations that are about organizing and power building in our communities. So that is, and I appreciate just the very specific strategy around back office boot camp. I love it. That's genius. So we're coming down to the wire, colleagues, and I did want to get very specific in our last few minutes. And Makisha, let me stay with you for a minute, and just talk about the importance of policy agenda in this moment. What policymakers need to be focusing on. This issue about ensuring that this window doesn't close is clearly one, but I'm curious about other thoughts about what policymakers need to be thinking about. And I'm going to go around to all of you and ask the same question and then come back around philanthropy, but I want to separate them out a bit. So Makisha, just your thoughts in terms of policy agenda at this moment, policy priority.
Yeah, sure. So I want to do what Lauren did, which is shout out our home state, Colorado, and just share a little bit about what happened with the COVID, pandemic here. When I mentioned that we couldn't access funding in March and April, we quickly rung the alarm in our Black caucus and our Black mayor and our Black-led organizations like Women's Foundation of Colorado and the Colorado Health Foundation. And there's a Black CFO at the Colorado Trust. Across the ecosystem, there was Black leadership leading these efforts to make sure that we could point out that eligibility requirements for funding were excluding our businesses. Applications weren't easily accessible, or just plain dysfunctional. Funding streams were running through banks when our folks didn't have banking relationships. Outreach efforts were missing our communities and not targeting our businesses. So our policymakers, our philanthropists, we all came together. Black policymakers, Black leaders came together to help team up with our Black-led, Black-serving organizations to make sure that we could offer our emergency counting clinic. We could offer the crisis marketing support. We could make sure that we were on committees to change the eligibility requirements and the application structures for funding. And so if I was going to say anything about what should be done, is first hire Black leadership, make sure elect Black leadership, make sure your selection processes are culturally responsive, take into consideration for my philanthropists and foundations, that we have lower back office capacity and lower staff numbers. So when you're funding us, think about how you're setting expectations around progress monitoring and reporting and relationships. We often get less funding and often have to manage more grantors just to meet our budget goals. And so we have more people to report out to. And then finally, end the stigma associated with Black specific programming. For many years prior to the pandemic, I was told I wouldn't get funded if I only targeted Black women, that I had to lump it into a BIPOC category or service Black and women and men, despite the fact that we're the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs and the least funded, despite our unique experiences with things like hair discrimination. And so I just think policymakers and philanthropists should make sure we come together to do culturally responsive work in service of social justice.
Lakeisha, thank you, thank you, thank you. My goodness. Lauren, I'm going to ask you to go next, and Chris, I'll ask you to have the final word. What's the advice to philanthropy and policymakers? Yes.
When we were planning the session and I was told that Makisha could join me, I knew my job was done. So thrilled to have her. One of the things that I would ask for us, the bell has been rung around childcare. And even as we think about entrepreneurs, of course, many of those may be run out of people's homes, but looking at childcare, trying to do that when kids are home and in learning, hopefully online, if you have access to that, is a crisis within this country. And I think that I would urge policymakers to continue to take a look at childcare. Men and women have learned during the pandemic how important that is. The other is the technology divide. That has been alluded to here as well. So, you know, we've used the word infrastructure a lot. I think that we need to broaden the sense of infrastructure. The child tax credit, I think, is another infrastructure piece that is important to support families and individuals. And even as we think about Black women in business, the impact for Black women who have been movement leaders forever, but of other policies such as mass incarceration, also are intertwined. So when we look at Black families and Black communities, it's not an either or. Our focus today has been on women, but we need to look at how we build up our communities in a larger systemic policy and philanthropic perspective. So thank you, Susan, for the opportunity. And Makisha, thanks for joining me and repping Colorado.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. Our good colleague, Chris at JP Morgan, I'm going to give you the last words in terms of what philanthropy and policymakers should be focused on now as it relates to Black businesses. Yeah.
Colorado is a lovely state, I'll just say. I don't live in Colorado. I don't want to be left out of that part. Look, I'll do this quickly because I only have a few minutes. And I want to first recognize the tension between the two things I was going to highlight. One is like just targeting, and in some sense, this is a summary of a bunch of things Makisha, I think, very helpfully pointed at, right? In terms of there has been an increased willingness of, I think, policy to consider like fairly specific targeting in a way that I think was not necessarily true in the past. And I think that has, we've seen the impact of doing so. And so to the extent that there's any way to keep that on the table, and given the progress that you can make when you do so, I think that that's a really important thing for people to lift up, point out when it works, and remind folks, you know, like 5-10 years from now, like, well, you know, 2020, this is what we did. The other one is just like the speed of delivery of capital, which is super hard, and it's harder when you target. Like it's a tension I want to call out. But to the extent that there's an ability to find a good balance there, to think about it before the fact so that you are ready to do it like when the next crisis comes up, we the only way I can really think of resolving that tension. But I do think that like many small businesses are not getting through the process because the process is complicated or because it is long, and whatever innovations we can do around making that less complicated and shorter while balancing the targeting concern, I think would both be good pushes.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. The time has gone so fast. Lauren, Makisha, Chris, thank you so much for this important conversation. Again, our continued thanks to JP Morgan to sort of being with AbbVie on these issues. I want to just leave a message to colleagues watching. Now is the time, quite frankly, for leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus and Black Foundation CEOs to get together more intentionally and talk about investing in Black businesses and building Black wealth. So appreciate all the work, all the heavy lift of each and every one of you, and everybody take care and stay safe out there.